It's strange how much of your life can be spent living in the shadow of someone else's expectations. Especially when you're a child. I guess I never realized how invisible I was. How quietly I had been forgotten in my own family until it was almost too late. My parents, well, they were always busy with their lives. Their own needs, their own dreams. The idea of being a family unit, of feeling important or needed, was more a notion than a reality. I grew up in a house that was always full of love. At least in theory, my parents had a way of making everything seem perfect, especially when it came to appearances. They both worked hard, too hard, I'd say, but what they never seemed to realize was that I needed something more than just food, shelter, and the occasional, "I love you," tossed my way like a loose coin. I needed them. I needed them to see me not just as an accessory to their busy lives, but as a person. There's this moment I remember, though, a day when it all became clear to me. Although I didn't fully understand it at the time, my mother was fussing over my father's tie, and he was sitting in the kitchen, reading the newspaper, ignoring the way her hands trembled as she adjusted the fabric. I could see how the tension between them grew as they prepared for this event. Their second wedding. They had been married once before, and after a long divorce, they'd decided to give it another shot. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance for them to prove to themselves, and to us, that they could make it work. And then came the invitation. When my parents first announced they were getting married again, I felt a flutter of excitement, more out of obligation than anything else. It was a big deal. They said everyone would be invited, family, friends, distant cousins. They made sure to include me in the conversation, as though that would make me feel special. But there was always something a little off about their tone. Something was missing, even though the words they spoke seemed to suggest the opposite. They were busy, very busy. My mother would spend hours on the phone with the wedding planner, discussing flowers, the guest list, the menu. My father, on the other hand, would disappear into his office, calling his lawyer to go over the details of the divorce settlement. At first, I didn't think much of it. They were just focused on the wedding. Right, but then I realized that their focus wasn't just on the wedding itself, it was on the idea of it. The perfect ceremony, the perfect reception, the perfect future. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't really part of that picture. My parents kept talking about how I would help with the wedding, how they needed me to be involved. But every time I tried to get closer, I was given a task: pick up the flowers, help arrange seating charts, run errands for the caterers. The more I tried to insert myself into their plans, the more I realized how little I actually mattered in them. The signs were small at first, barely noticeable if you weren't paying attention. They'd ask me to pick out my own dress for the wedding, then forget to follow up on it. Or they'd mention the wedding invitations and ask if I had anyone to invite. But there was no real discussion about who I might want there. Everything felt like a formality, and the wedding, while important to them, was never about creating lasting memories as a family. It was more about what they could show the world, what they could say they'd accomplished. It was my own fault. Really, I should have spoken up. I should have said, "Hey, I need you to care about this too." But I didn't. Maybe I didn't think it mattered. I convinced myself that I was just being overly sensitive, that I should be happy to be involved in some way even if it wasn't as a central part of the day. My friends would tell me it was normal for parents to be absorbed in their wedding, that it didn't mean they loved me any less. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about love. It was about something else entirely, something I couldn't put my finger on yet. As the wedding day approached, the distance between us only grew. There were days when my parents barely spoke to me at all, too wrapped up in their own little world. I remember one afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table while my mother sat on the phone with the caterer, trying to finalize the menu. My father, as usual, was in the other room, fiddling with the wedding rings. The air was thick with tension, nothing overt, but you could feel it in the space between us. It was as though we were all living in our own separate bubbles. And somehow, mine was the furthest away. At the same time, I was told to keep myself busy with small tasks, things that didn't matter. I was asked to run to the store for more champagne glasses. I was asked to help choose centerpieces. There were times when I was in the same room as them, physically present, but I felt invisible. I'd try to initiate conversation, but they were always distracted, always preoccupied with something that didn't involve me. There's a part of me that thought, maybe, just maybe, I was imagining all this. Maybe I was being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew that I was being sidelined. It wasn't even a conscious decision on their part. It was just the way things were. The wedding was everything. And I was simply there. The closer we got to the wedding day, the more everything around me seemed to intensify. My parents became more frazzled. They were more stressed than I had ever seen them. But instead of turning to me for support or even acknowledging that I existed in this moment, they leaned on each other. They leaned on the wedding planner. They leaned on everyone except me. It wasn't the actual ceremony or the event itself that was bothering me. It was everything leading up to it. The way they acted as if I was just another guest, another cog in the wheel, another person to help set things in motion. I was expected to be a part of the event, but only in the most superficial way possible. They weren't interested in hearing my thoughts on the wedding or even acknowledging how this might feel for me. I wasn't part of the family anymore. I was just an extension of their wedding day. Our prop. The morning of the wedding started like any other chaotic, last-minute preparation day. I could hear my mother bustling around the house, her voice raised in excited conversation with whoever she was on the phone with at the moment. I wasn't surprised by the frenzy. I had seen it build up over the past few days. What struck me most was how little attention anyone was giving me. I had been given a vague assignment earlier that week: pick up a few relatives at the airport, help the caterers unload, that sort of thing. I thought maybe I'd be a little more involved in the ceremony. Maybe even sit with my parents. But as the hours ticked by and the wedding drew nearer, it was clear that no one was paying much attention to me. I dressed in my best suit, the one they bought for me months ago. But even as I put it on, I could feel how misplaced the effort felt. I wasn't a part of the picture. I was an accessory to the event. My mother was too busy to even acknowledge my presence as she adjusted her dress in front of the mirror. My father was nowhere to be found. The house was full of activity, people running around, but none of them seemed to care whether I was there or not. I wandered aimlessly through the house, feeling like I was in a dream where nothing felt quite real. I wanted to be part of something important, to feel like I mattered. But the truth was, I felt more like an invisible figure watching from the sidelines. I thought about asking my mother if I was supposed to be at the church with them. But she was so absorbed in last-minute wedding details that it didn't seem worth it. Maybe I'd just follow the flow and hope someone noticed me. By the time I finished getting dressed, the tension had escalated. Everyone was running late. The florist was behind schedule. The photographer was snapping last-minute shots of the decorations. I tried calling my father to ask when we would be leaving for the ceremony, but my calls went straight to voicemail. The clock kept ticking. I stood in the hallway, shifting nervously from foot to foot. The more I waited, the more I started to feel a knot in my stomach. Something wasn't right. There had been no instructions. No one asking if I was ready, if I needed anything. No one had even told me when we were supposed to leave. Was I supposed to drive myself there? I didn't know. I checked the time again. The wedding ceremony was supposed to start in an hour. I looked out the window, expecting to see a car pull up at any moment to pick me up. But nothing. No sign of anyone. Just a small group of guests gathering at the entrance, too preoccupied with their own arrivals to notice I was still there. The anxiety inside me grew. I called my mother again. The line rang several times before she picked up. Yeah, she answered, her voice distracted. When are we leaving for the wedding? I asked. She paused. Oh, you're ready? Okay, you know what? I totally forgot. We got caught up with last-minute details. You're going to have to take your own car to the venue. I'll send someone to meet you when you get there. We'll be waiting for you. I could feel my heart sink into my stomach. It wasn't even a real apology. It was like an afterthought. A business transaction. Okay, I said, but the words felt hollow. I grabbed the car keys off the counter, still reeling from the realization that I was entirely alone in this moment. The drive to the church was long and silent, with only my thoughts for company. I could barely focus on the road. My mind kept replaying everything that had happened, everything that hadn't happened. Really, how could my own parents forget about me? How could they be so caught up in their perfect day that they didn't even think about the person who was supposed to be by their side? I tried to reassure myself. I was overreacting. They were busy. But as I drove on, the feeling of abandonment deepened, and a wave of frustration washed over me. I had been forgotten. My entire life had been spent on the periphery. And this moment, the day that was supposed to bring us closer, had cemented it. By the time I reached the church, the ceremony had already started. I parked in the back lot, my car tucked among the other vehicles that belonged to people who were already inside. I walked through the church's back entrance, my shoes echoing down the empty hallway. The doors to the main hall were closed. I paused, my hand resting on the door handle. Inside, I could hear the sound of soft music and muffled voices. The ceremony already underway. I tried to steady my breath. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. But the reality hit harder than anything I could have imagined. No one was waiting for me. No one seemed to notice I was there. The guests had already settled into their seats. The wedding party standing proudly at the altar. And I was just another face in the crowd. I stood there for a while, unsure of what to do next. My heart was pounding in my chest. My mind racing. What was I supposed to do now? I had been completely forgotten. The people who should have cared about me, the people I had always loved and admired, had cast me aside without a second thought. I slowly backed away from the door, retreating into the shadows of the church's hallway. I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. My entire life had led to this moment of quiet rejection. And it hurt more than I ever expected it to. The anger I'd been suppressing started to surface, bubbling beneath the surface of my calm exterior. For the first time in years, I realized just how insignificant I was to them. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't an oversight. This was the culmination of everything that had gone wrong between us. I had been living in their shadow, trying to be someone I wasn't, someone they never even truly saw. When the ceremony finally ended, I was still standing there, lost in my thoughts. I watched through the church's windows as my parents, hand in hand, made their way out of the building, greeting guests, laughing, and posing for pictures. It was their perfect day, but I wasn't part of it. I waited in the hallway, hoping maybe someone would come looking for me. But no one did. I had no choice but to leave. By the time I got to the reception, the party had already started. The music was loud, the lights were dimmed, and people were laughing and dancing. But I was just there. No one approached me. No one asked me where I had been or why I was late. I tried to make myself blend into the background, but it felt impossible. I finally caught my mother's eye across the room. She smiled and waved, as though everything was fine. As though I was fine. But I wasn't fine. I don't know exactly when it happened, but the weight of everything hit me all at once. Standing at the reception, watching my parents enjoy their moment, I felt this crushing clarity that I was nothing more than a forgotten obligation. I had spent my whole life waiting for them to notice me, for them to see me for who I truly was. But today, like all the days before it, they didn't, and that hurt more than anything else. I should have been angry, furious, even, but instead, I felt numb. A kind of hollow emptiness spread over me, making everything around me seem distant. The chatter, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all felt so far away, like I was trapped behind a glass wall, just watching. I didn't matter to them. I never had. I thought about leaving, just getting in my car and driving away. But something held me there, lingering on the edge of a decision I didn't know how to make. Was I supposed to make a scene? Could I just walk away and pretend like none of this mattered? Or should I confront them, finally tell them how much they had hurt me? How much I had been ignored and forgotten? Not just today, but for years. But no, I was tired of being ignored. Tired of waiting for them to wake up and realize that I had been standing right in front of them all this time. It wasn't long before I saw them, finally free from their wedding duties and making their rounds among the guests. My mother's eyes met mine, and she gave me a casual smile, but there was no real warmth in it, just a smile for the sake of appearances. I wanted to yell at her. I wanted to ask her how she could let this happen, how she could let me be forgotten like this. How could she stand there, surrounded by people who loved her, while I was left in the shadows? But I couldn't do it, not yet. Instead, I watched them for a while longer, the way they interacted with everyone else, laughing, enjoying themselves, and with each passing moment, the resentment inside me grew, until I couldn't hold it in anymore. I walked away from the crowd, my feet carrying me in the direction of the parking lot, where I could get some air. I don't know how long I stood there before I heard footsteps behind me. When I turned, I saw my father. He didn't seem surprised to see me, but there was no concern, no real care in his expression, just a kind of detachment that only made everything worse. "You okay?" he asked, his voice almost too calm. I stared at him for a moment, taking in his appearance, the crisp tuxedo, the wedding ring on his finger, his perfectly coiffed hair. He looked so complete, and I looked like nothing, like I didn't matter. "No," I said, my voice breaking before I could stop it. "I'm not okay. You forgot about me, both of you." He blinked, as though surprised. "What do you mean? You've been part of this, haven't you?" I could feel the tears starting to sting my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I didn't want to be vulnerable. Not anymore. No, I haven't, I said, my voice growing steadier. You've been so caught up in this, I gestured vaguely at the celebration around us, that you didn't even think to check on me. You didn't think I'd need anything. You didn't even think about me. He stood there for a moment, his face hardening into something I couldn't quite read. You know it wasn't intentional, he said finally. It was just a big day. And we got caught up. You should have been more proactive if you felt left out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had always tried to make myself visible to them, tried to find ways to insert myself into their lives. But it was never enough. Nothing I did ever seemed to matter. You don't get it, do you? I said, my voice growing louder. This isn't about the wedding. It's about everything. All the years I spent trying to be seen. And you still don't see me. You never did. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized I didn't need to beg for their attention anymore. I didn't need to wait for them to acknowledge me. I could make them see me. I could make the world see what they had done. I turned away from him, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. It was time to tell the truth. Time to expose the facade they had so carefully crafted. No more pretending that everything was fine. No more hiding the pain they had caused. I would share my story, the real story. The story of a child who was never truly part of the family. I spent the rest of the evening preparing for it in my head. It wouldn't be a public outburst, not at first. But I would get my truth out. I would make them face me. And I would make them face the consequences of their neglect. The next day was surreal. My parents were still caught up in the afterglow of the wedding. Basking in the attention, the well wishes, and the satisfaction of a perfect day. Meanwhile, I sat in the corner, watching it all unfold like a spectator at my own life. They didn't notice the quiet rebellion that was brewing inside me. They didn't notice how their silence was turning into a deafening roar. I didn't tell anyone right away. I didn't shout it from the rooftops. But over the next few days, I began to share my feelings. I told my closest friends, the ones who had always been there for me. I sent a message to my extended family, sharing my side of the story, recounting how I had been forgotten and neglected by my own parents. To my surprise, they listened. They didn't brush me off. They didn't minimize what I was feeling. And slowly, bit by bit, the truth started to trickle out. People began to ask questions. People began to demand answers. And as much as my parents tried to brush it aside, they couldn't escape the reality anymore. The truth had been exposed. The fallout wasn't immediate. It took time, months, even for everything to settle. But when it did, I felt a strange sense of peace. I had been heard. I had been seen. I wasn't invisible anymore. My relationship with my parents didn't return to normal. But it didn't need to. I had learned something far more important. I wasn't defined by their neglect. I could stand on my own. And I didn't need their approval or validation to be whole. For the first time in my life, I was enough for myself. In the end, I didn't expose them to tear them down or ruin their lives. I did it because I needed to free myself. And once I did, I realized I was finally in control of my own story. The first few weeks after everything came to light were chaotic. I had braced myself for anger, for accusations, for some kind of fallout from my parents. But surprisingly, it didn't come in the form I expected. My mother reached out to me first. She called late one evening, her voice surprisingly soft. "I'm sorry," she said, her words tentative and fragile, as though she didn't quite know how to begin. "I didn't realize how much you were hurting. I've been selfish." It wasn't the apology I had dreamed of, the sweeping acknowledgement of all the years of neglect. But it was something. My father, on the other hand, took longer. He was more defensive, more proud, but even he couldn't deny the truth. He never admitted fault outright. But there were small gestures, moments when I could feel him trying to bridge the gap between us. For a while, I wasn't sure how to feel. It was almost surreal. After years of longing for this kind of acknowledgement, I had to decide what to do with it now that it was finally here. The next few months were an emotional roller coaster. My parents were trying, in their own clumsy way, to reconnect with me. They didn't fully understand how deep the hurt went. But they were trying. I could see it in the way my mother remembered my favorite food at dinner. In the way my father started calling to check in on me after work. Small things, but they mattered. It was hard for me to trust it at first. I was still angry at the years I had spent feeling invisible. Angry at the silence that had stretched between us like a canyon. But I couldn't stay angry forever. I knew that, deep down, I wanted a relationship with them. But not on their terms. Not when I had to fight for every ounce of love and attention. I needed to find a new way forward. One where I didn't have to constantly prove my worth to them. Where I didn't have to beg for their love. In time, I started focusing less on what my parents hadn't given me and more on what I could give myself. I started to build my own life independent of their expectations. Independent of their approval. I traveled. I pursued things that made me happy. Whether that meant taking up painting or spending more time with friends who actually cared about me. I took my time to rediscover who I was outside of the confines of the roles I had played in my family. The truth was, I was no longer the person who would allow myself to be forgotten. I had a voice, and I was learning how to use it. The distance between my parents and me remained. We didn't have the closeness we once had when I was a child. But I was okay with that. I was learning to let go of the idea of perfection. The idea that families had to be flawless. I had spent so much of my life trying to fix something that wasn't mine to fix. It wasn't until a few months later that I fully understood the impact of what I had done. My parents' marriage, while still in its early stages, had been altered by the exposure of their neglect. It wasn't a dramatic, tear-filled confrontation, but it had forced him to face the truth about their behavior. They were never going to be the parents I had once hoped for. But they were trying to be better. I knew I would never be able to erase the hurt from the past. But I was learning to live with it. I realized that the most important relationship was the one I had with myself. For years, I had tried to mold myself into someone my parents would love. Someone they could be proud of. But now, I was learning how to be proud of myself, no matter what. And slowly, my relationship with my parents began to shift. Not back to what it had been, but to something more honest, more real. The day came when I finally felt that weight I'd been carrying around for so long lift from my shoulders. I had spent my entire life feeling like an afterthought. But now, I was my own person. I had been through the storm, had faced the loneliness, the isolation, the disappointment, and I had survived it. I wasn't waiting for them to fix me anymore. I had fixed myself. One evening, as I sat with my mother in the living room, watching TV in silence, she turned to me and said, "I don't know how to make up for what I did, but I want you to know I'm trying. I just don't always know how." And for the first time, I didn't feel a rush of bitterness. I felt something else, peace. I nodded, smiled, and said, "I know, Mom, I know." That was the moment everything changed. Not because they had finally done something right, but because I had learned to stop waiting for them to do it. I had learned to live my life without their approval, to be enough on my own. And in that, I found the freedom I had been searching for all along. The journey wasn't easy. It wasn't a straight line from hurt to healing. It was messy and complicated, full of twists and turns that I didn't see coming. But in the end, I emerged stronger and more sure of who I was. The pain of being forgotten had led me to discover something far more powerful, my own voice. And while my relationship with my parents was still a work in progress, I had finally learned the most important lesson of all. I didn't need their validation to feel worthy. I didn't need their attention to know that I was loved, because I loved myself, and that was all that really mattered.